Chapter 6, Part 1, His Majesty King Louis XIII. The incident caused a great stir. Monsieur de Treville thundered against his musketeers in public and congratulated them in private. But since there was no time to lose in informing the king of what had happened, he hurried to the Louvre. It was already too late. The king was having a private conversation with the cardinal. Treville was told that His Majesty was working and could not receive him for the moment. That evening he went to the king's card game. His Majesty was winning, and since he was miserly, this had put him in an excellent humor. As soon as he saw Treville, he called out to him, "Come here, Captain, come here, and let me scold you. Do you know that His Eminence came to complain to me about your musketeers, and I was so upset that he's ill this evening? What ruffians those musketeers are. They're all fit to be hanged." "No, sire," replied Treville, who realized the direction the conversation was about to take. "They're all gentle as lambs, and their only desire is never to draw their swords except in the service of their king. But His Eminency's guards are always picking quarrels with them, and for the honor of the corps, the poor young men are forced to defend themselves." "Listen to Monsieur de Treville," said the king. "Just listen to him. He sounds as if he were talking about a religious order. Captain, I'm tempted to take your command away from you and give it to Mademoiselle de Chimerault, since I've promised her a convent. But don't think I'll simply take your word for what happened. I'm called Louis the Just, Monsieur de Treville, and we'll soon see." "Because I have faith in your justice, sire, I'll wait patiently and confidently till it pleases you to hear me." "Wait then, but I won't be keeping you waiting very long." The king's luck had just changed, and since he was on the verge of losing more than he had won, he was glad to have an excuse for stopping while he was still ahead. He stood up and pocketed the money in front of him, most of which he'd won. "Take my place, La Vauvenel," he said. "I have an important matter to discuss with Monsieur de Treville. I had 80 louis on the table. Put the same amount in front of you so that those who are losing will have no cause for complaint. Justice above all." He then turned to Monsieur de Treville and walked over to a window recess with him. "So you maintain that His Eminency's guards picked a quarrel with your musketeers?" "Yes, sire, as always." "Then tell me how it happened. As you know, a judge must listen to both sides." "It happened quite simply. The musketeers involved were 3 of my best men whose names are known to you, sire. Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. You have appreciated their devotion more than once, and I know that serving you means more to them than anything else in the world. They were going to have a picnic with a young Gascon I'd recommended to them this morning. The picnic was to take place at Saint-Germain, I believe, and they'd all agreed to meet at the Comte de Chaux monastery. There they encountered Jussac, Cahusac, and Bescaret, and 2 other guards who certainly hadn't come there in such a large group without unlawful intentions. Aha! They must have been coming there to fight among themselves. I'm not accusing them, your Majesty, but I leave to you to decide what 5 armed men could have been doing in such an isolated spot." "You're right, Treville, you're right. Then, when they saw my men, they forgot their own quarrels and thought only of their hatred for the musketeers. As you know, sire, the musketeers who serve you are the natural enemies of the guards of those who serve the cardinal." "Yes, Treville," the king said mournfully, "and it's sad to see 2 factions in France, 2 heads of state. But it will end. You say the guards picked a quarrel with the musketeers?" "It's likely, but I can't swear to it. You know how difficult it is to learn the truth, at least for those of us not gifted with the admirable instinct that has earned you the name of Louis the Just." "Quite so, Treville, quite so. But your musketeers weren't alone. There was a young man with them?" "He's really only a boy, sire, and one of my musketeers had recently been wounded. So 2 able-bodied musketeers, a wounded one, and a boy not only held their own against 5 of the cardinal's best guards, but left 4 of them lying on the ground." "That's a victory!" cried the king, his face radiant. "A complete victory." "Yes, sire, as complete as the victory at the Sand Bridge." 2 able-bodied men, a wounded one, and a boy? I suppose he could be called a youth, and he fought so well that I'll take the liberty of commending him to your attention, sire. "What's his name?" "D'Artagnan, your Majesty. He's the son of one of my oldest friends, a man who fought for your illustrious father in the religious wars." "And you say he fought well? Tell me about it. Treville, you know I like stories of war and combat." King Louis XIII proudly twirled his mustache and put one hand on his hip. As I told you, sire, Monsieur d'Artagnan is almost a child, and since he doesn't have the honor of being a musketeer, he was in civilian clothes. When the cardinal's guards saw how young he was and that he didn't belong to the musketeers, they offered to let him leave before they attacked. You see, Tréville, the king interrupted, they were the ones who attacked. What you say is true, sire. It's quite clear. When they offered to let him leave, he answered that since he was a musketeer in his heart and completely devoted to his king, he would stay with the musketeers. What a fine young man, murmured the king. He did stay with them, and he said he would. He did stay with them as he said he would, and he's such a stalwart supporter of your majesty that it was he who gave Jussac the terrible wound that made the cardinal so angry. He's the one who wounded Jussac? He, a mere child? That's impossible, Tréville. Yes, it's true, your majesty. But Jussac is one of the best swordsmen in the kingdom. Yes, sire, and he met a better one. I want to see that young man, Tréville, and do something for him. When will you deign to receive him, your majesty? Tomorrow at noon. Shall I bring him alone? No, bring the 4 of them together. I want to thank all of them. Devoted men are rare, Tréville, and devotion must be rewarded. We'll come to the Louvre at noon, sire. Come by the way of the private staircase. There's no need for the cardinal to know. Yes, sire. You understand, Tréville. An edict is an edict. Duels are still forbidden. But this wasn't a duel, sire. This was a common brawl, since there were 5 of the cardinal's guards against my 3 musketeers and Monsieur d'Artagnan. Yes, you're right, said the king. Even so, come by way of the private staircase. Tréville smiled, but since he had already accomplished a great deal in making his child rebel against his master, he bowed respectfully to the king and, with his permission, took leave of him. That same evening, the 3 musketeers were notified of the honor that had been granted them. Since they had known the king a long time, they were not too elated, but D'Artagnan, with his Gascon imagination, saw fortune within reach and spent the night dreaming of golden dreams. He went to see Athos at 8 o'clock the next morning and found him dressed and ready to go out. Since their meeting with the king was not to take place until noon, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis had decided to play tennis on a court near the Luxembourg stables. Athos invited D'Artagnan to join them. Although he had never played tennis and knew nothing about it, D'Artagnan accepted the invitation because he did not know what else to do with his time until noon. Porthos and Aramis had already arrived at the court. Athos, who excelled in all sports, took D'Artagnan as his partner and challenged the other 2 to a game. But with the first movement he made, even though he was playing with his left hand, he realized that his wound was still too fresh to allow him such exertion. D'Artagnan was thus left without a partner, and since he admitted he had no experience in the game, the others merely practiced with him without counting points. One ball, launched by Porthos's Herculean wrist, passed within a hair's breadth of D'Artagnan's face. It occurred to him that if the ball had hit him, he might have been unable to present himself or his audience with the king. In his Gascon imagination, his whole future hung on that audience, so he politely bowed to Porthos and Aramis and told them that he would play with them at some other time, when he was better able to compete with them, and went to join the spectators. Unfortunately for him, among the spectators was one of the cardinal's guards, who, inflamed by his companion's defeat the day before, had sworn to avenge it at the first opportunity. Seeing D'Artagnan, he felt that this opportunity had arrived. It's not surprising, he said to the man beside him, that a young man was afraid of a ball. He's probably an apprentice musketeer. D'Artagnan spun around as if he had been bitten by a snake and glared at the guard who had just made the insolent remark. You can look at me as much as you like, the guard told him, arrogantly twirling his mustache. I still said what I said. Since what you said is too clear to need an explanation, D'Artagnan replied in an undertone, I'll ask you to come with me. When? The guard asked with the same mocking arrogance. Now. You know who I am, don't you? Nope, I don't care. You should, because you might be in less of a hurry if you knew my name. What is it? Bernerjou, at your service. Very well, Monsieur Bernerjou, D'Artagnan said calmly. I'll wait for you at the gate. Go ahead, I'll follow you. Don't follow me too closely. We mustn't let anyone think we're leaving together. We don't want spectators for what we have to do. No, we don't, said Bernerjou, surprised that his name had produced no effect on the young man. D'Artagnan may have been the only man in Paris who had never heard of him, for he was one of those involved most often in the daily fights that all the edicts of the king and the cardinal had been unable to suppress. Porthos and Aramis were so absorbed in their game, and Athos was watching them so attentively, that they did not see D'Artagnan leave. D'Artagnan stopped at the gate as he had said he would do. A few minutes later, Bernajoux also stepped outside. D'Artagnan had no time to lose since his audience with the king was set for noon. He looked up and down the street and saw that it was deserted. "It's lucky for you, even though your name is Bernajoux," he said to his adversary, "that you're only dealing with an apprentice musketeer. Don't worry, I'll do my best. On guard." "But this isn't a very good place," protested Bernajoux. "I think we'd be less likely to be bestirred behind the Saint-Germain Abbey or in the Pré aux Clercs." "What you say is very sensible," replied D'Artagnan, "but unfortunately I don't have much time because I have an appointment at 12 o'clock. So, on guard, sir." Bernajoux was not a man who needed to have such an invitation repeated twice to him. His sword flashed in the sunlight, and he attacked vigorously, hoping that his adversary's youth would let him be intimidated. But D'Artagnan had served his apprenticeship the day before. Fresh from his victory and buoyed by his future favor, he was determined not to give an inch of ground. The two swords were engaged to the hilt, and since D'Artagnan stood firm, it was Bernajoux who stepped back. D'Artagnan took advantage of this movement. He disengaged his sword, lunged, and pierced his adversary's shoulder. He then stepped back and raised his sword, but Bernajoux shouted that it was nothing, lunged blindly at him, and spitted himself on D'Artagnan's sword. D'Artagnan did not know how seriously his opponent had been wounded, for he did not fall or admit defeat, but merely stepped back in the direction of Monsieur de la Tremoille's house, where one of his relatives was a member of the household. D'Artagnan pressed him relentlessly, and would no doubt have finished him off with a third thrust if the other two guards, hearing the sound of fighting and having seen D'Artagnan exchange a few words with Bernajoux and then leave, had not rushed out with drawn swords and attacked him. But Athos, Porthos, and Aramis appeared at almost the same moment and forced the two guards to turn away from D'Artagnan. Then Bernajoux fell. Since the two guards were now facing four enemies, they began calling for help from Monsieur de Tremoille's house. When the men in the house came running out, the four companions shouted, "Musketeers, we need help!" Such shouts were usually heeded, for the musketeers were known to be enemies of the cardinal and were liked because of their hatred of him. Guards from the companies other than those belonging to the Red Duke, as Aramis had called him, nearly always sided with the musketeers in this kind of quarrel. 3 guards from Monsieur de Essart's company were passing by. 2 of them came to the aid of the 4 companions, while the third ran off to Monsieur de Trevelle's house, calling for help. As usual, Monsieur de Trevelle's house was full of musketeers. They hurried to help their comrades. In the free-for-all that followed, the musketeers had the advantage of number. Their adversaries retreated to Monsieur de la Tremoille's house and succeeded in locking the doors in time. As for Bernajoux, he had already been carried into the house seriously wounded. The musketeers and their allies were greatly agitated. They discussed setting fire to the house to punish Monsieur de la Tremoille's servants for their insolence in attacking the king's musketeers. This idea had just been enthusiastically adopted when, luckily, a clock struck 11. D'Artagnan and his friends remembered their audience, and since they would have regretted having such a fine exploit performed without them, they succeeded in persuading the others not to burn down the house. A few paving stones were thrown against the doors, but the doors held fast, and the attackers soon gave up, especially since those who had been regarded as the instigators of the attack had already left and were on their way to Monsieur de Trevelle's house. By the time they arrived, Trevelle had already learned of the clash. "Hurry," he said to them. "We must go straight to the Louvre and try to see the king before the cardinal has told him what's happened. We'll describe it to him as a result of yesterday's affair, and he'll let both pass together." That's the end of part 1. I'm breaking this one up.